At her birthday party, he poured coffee in her face. But what she did next, no one expected. Subscribe and subscribe in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun crept in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, golden stripes across the immaculate white marble of the kitchen floor. Outside, the soft hum of sprinklers and the occasional chirp of a bird were the only sounds to disturb the silence of the pristine neighborhood. Inside, the house was still. Too still. Everything was in its place, untouched, as though part of a staged photograph in a glossy magazine. The soft whir of the refrigerator and the ticking of the minimalist designer clock above the pantry were the only reminders that time still moved here. Noelle stood barefoot on the cold marble, wrapped in a silk robe the color of bone. It had been a gift from Justin, like most of the things in her wardrobe. Elegant, expensive, neutral. She no longer remembered when she had stopped choosing her own clothes. She reached for the French press on the counter and poured herself a cup of coffee, careful not to let the stream splash against the rim of the cup. Even the sound of pouring seemed intrusive in the sterile quiet of the kitchen. The aroma of the coffee filled the air, earthy, bitter, refined. She took a sip and winced slightly. Black, no sugar, no cream, no cinnamon, just the way Justin liked it. Years ago, she had loved her coffee sweet, with oat milk and a dusting of nutmeg. Now, this was all she drank. She didn't remember when she made the switch or whether she had done it consciously. It was simply one of many small things that had changed over time, folded into a life that looked perfect from the outside. She moved to the dining room, her footsteps muffled by the pale gray rug that covered the hardwood. The table was a sleek rectangle of glass and chrome, surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in off-white leather. A bowl of artificial green apples sat perfectly arranged in the center. She sat down at her usual place and stared out the large window, watching the sunlight rise over the hedged lawn and trimmed shrubbery. Everything was so beautiful, so curated, so painfully hollow. Justin was still asleep upstairs, most likely sprawled across the king-sized bed in a t-shirt and boxers, one arm flung across her side of the bed. He always slept late on Sundays. Noelle had long since given up expecting him to join her for morning coffee. In the early years, they had done it together. Talked, laughed, shared plans and dreams. But that had faded like everything else that once made her feel like a participant in her own life. The silence was starting to weigh on her chest. She pulled her phone from the pocket of her robe and absently scrolled through messages. One caught her eye. It was from Laya, her best friend from college, once her soul sister, now reduced to a distant name on a screen. Just wanted to remind you I'm here. If you ever need anything, love you, always. Noelle stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She didn't write back. She didn't delete it either. Instead, she locked the screen and set the phone down. That was the pattern now. Constant connection, yet no real contact. Laya had tried for years to stay close, but the effort had become one-sided, and eventually Noelle had stopped reaching back. It wasn't personal. It was just life. Or at least that's what she told herself. She walked back into the kitchen to pour another cup of coffee and almost missed the sound of Justin's footsteps descending the stairs. His presence filled the room before he even said a word. There was always something about the way he moved, measured, intentional, in control. He wore navy blue loungewear, his blonde hair slightly tousled, and his face freshly shaven. "Mornin'," he said, his voice still thick with sleep, but not unpleasant. "Morning," she replied, forcing a smile. He glanced at the cup in her hand and smirked approvingly. "Still drinking it black, huh?" She nodded, not trusting herself to say anything. Justin leaned against the counter and stretched, groaning slightly. "So, I've finalized the plans for next weekend. Your birthday's going to be spectacular." Noel blinked. "Plans?" "Yeah," he said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I booked the Calder House. Gorgeous place, upstate, private event staff, valet, the works. Guest list is set. Caterers confirmed. It's going to be elegant, tasteful, just like you." She felt the familiar sinking in her stomach. He hadn't asked her opinion. He never did. And still she nodded. "That's lovely, thank you." Justin grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "I figured you'd appreciate me taking the stress off your plate. I mean, let's face it, you've been swamped with work. You deserve to relax and let someone else handle things for once." It wasn't a lie. She was busy at work, managing a high-profile brand campaign that had consumed most of her time and energy. But it wasn't the truth either. She would have preferred something quiet, maybe a dinner with Laya and her parents, or even just a long walk on the beach. But preferences didn't matter in a life choreographed by Justin. He moved toward her and kissed the top of her head, then reached for his own coffee. She watched as he moved around the kitchen, confident, comfortable, utterly unaware of the growing distance between them. Or perhaps he was aware. Perhaps he just didn't care. Later that morning, as she folded laundry in their spotless bedroom, she found herself staring at the framed photograph on Justin's nightstand. It was from their honeymoon in Capri years ago. They stood on a sun-drenched terrace, arms around each other, smiling for the camera. She looked so happy, radiant, hopeful. Now she barely recognized the woman in that photo. She moved through the rest of the day on autopilot. Emails, dishes, tidying up. Noelle had become an expert in busying herself with the inconsequential. She wandered into the walk-in closet and ran her fingers across the rows of dresses, shoes, and handbags, all color-coordinated, all elegant, all approved by Justin. Once she had worn bold colors, Afrocentric patterns, giant hoop earrings. Now it was beige, black, navy. Clean lines, no texture, neutral everything, like her coffee. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The life she lived wasn't bad. It was safe, luxurious even. And yet the hollow feeling in her chest never seemed to leave. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped laughing, stopped creating, stopped dreaming. She didn't know exactly when it had happened. Maybe it was the first time Justin told her that her art was childish, or when he convinced her to stop sharing her sketches on Instagram, claiming it was too much exposure. Maybe it was when he suggested she pause her application to the design school she'd wanted to attend, just until they were more settled. She had agreed, believing it made sense, but they had never settled. Only he had. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the words in Laya's message. "If you ever need anything." Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a calendar notification. Birthday event, 6 days. She sighed and closed her eyes. She had everything, and yet it felt like she had nothing at all. She wondered, not for the first time, who she might have been if she'd never met Justin. And then, with a jolt of guilt, she wondered what it might be like to live a life of her own choosing, one that tasted like cinnamon and cream. The days leading up to Noelle's birthday passed in a quiet rhythm that might have seemed peaceful to an outsider, but to her it felt like drifting through a fog with no horizon in sight. Each morning, she rose early and moved through her routines with mechanical precision: shower, dress, coffee, drive. Her days were filled with meetings and deadlines, strategies and pitches, clients and colleagues. Her job in the marketing firm gave her structure, stability, and recognition. Yet even the praise there felt muted, dulled by a numbness she couldn't quite name. People smiled when they saw her, complimented her on her efficiency and calm demeanor, but she often wondered if any of them knew the weight she carried under the surface. On Monday morning, she arrived at the office just after 8. Her assistant, a bright 20-something named Camille, greeted her with the usual enthusiasm and handed her a coffee. Black, no sugar. Noelle thanked her, then stared at the cup for a long moment, as if willing herself to enjoy it. She took a sip. The bitterness settled on her tongue like a dare she had grown too tired to accept. The morning was consumed by a pitch meeting for a new eco-luxury skincare brand. Noelle delivered her presentation flawlessly, her voice steady, her slides clean and impactful. The clients were impressed. They applauded her insight and taste, called her a visionary. She smiled graciously, nodded, said all the right things, but as she walked back to her office, heels clicking on the polished floors, she couldn't shake the image of her younger self, barefoot in a cluttered dorm room, sketchpad balanced on her knees, paint staining her fingers, a light in her eyes that no one had needed to name. That version of her had once seemed so close. Now it felt like a myth. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the hum of conversation from the bullpen. The silence that greeted her was different from the one at home, less hollow, more honest. She stood for a moment, glancing at the neatly arranged books on the shelf, the framed certificates on the wall, the elegant, abstract print Justin had picked out for her birthday last year. It was tasteful, like everything he chose. Safe, colorless, not hers. She sat at her desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a small leather sketchbook, the edges worn, the pages slightly curled from years of neglect. She hadn't opened it in months, maybe years. Her fingers hovered over it, then pulled back. Not here. Not yet. Instead, she reached for her phone and opened her photo gallery, scrolling past dozens of event shots, boardroom selfies, and couples' portraits staged in front of expensive backdrops. She kept scrolling until she found the folder labeled College. There, buried beneath old snapshots of dorm parties and study groups, were pictures of her paintings, raw, messy, vivid, faces with two large eyes, women with halos of textured hair, hands reaching for light. She stared at one for a long time, a self-portrait she had done the week before graduating. She was looking straight into the viewer, defiant and unapologetic. She didn't look anything like the woman Noelle had become. A knock at the door snapped her out of the moment. Camille poked her head in, her expression hesitant. "Hey, just wanted to remind you your husband called about the final birthday guest list. He said to ask if you're okay with it." Noelle's stomach tightened. "Did he say who's on it?" Camille smiled awkwardly. "Not really. He said it was all people you'd want to see." Noelle nodded slowly. "Thanks. I'll follow up with him." When Camille left, Noelle sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Justin hadn't asked her about the guest list. He hadn't asked about anything. He had planned the event as though she were a brand to be launched, curated, positioned, presented. Her preferences were irrelevant. Her presence was merely a necessity. She remembered, suddenly, the first time she had missed one of her parents' anniversary dinners. It was shortly after she and Justin had moved in together. He had booked a last-minute weekend trip to Aspen, telling her they needed time away from the noise. She'd been hesitant. Her parents were expecting her, but he'd laughed it off. "Come on, Noah. They'll understand. You deserve a break. And besides, we need to focus on building our traditions now, right? She'd agreed. They'd flown to Aspen. He'd booked a luxury suite, taken her to wine tastings and spa appointments, held her hand in the snow. It had felt magical at the time. She hadn't noticed how easily he'd redirected her, how skillfully he'd made her feel like it had been her idea all along. There had been more instances like that. Her mother's 60th birthday, which she missed because Justin insisted they attend a fundraiser he deemed critical for networking. Her cousin's art exhibition in Harlem, which Justin said wasn't really her scene anymore. The time Laya invited her on a girls' weekend, and he'd convinced her it would be exhausting and full of drama. It hadn't happened overnight. Justin didn't shout. He didn't forbid. He guided. He suggested. He reminded her what was best. Until, eventually, she stopped choosing for herself. That evening, at home, she brought it up. Not the whole truth, just the guest list. "I was wondering," she said cautiously, "if we could add a few of my friends to the invite list for Saturday. Maybe Laya, and maybe—" Justin looked up from his laptop, eyes narrowed slightly. "Laya? Didn't you say she's been distant lately?" Noelle hesitated. "Only because I've been preoccupied. I'd really like to see her." Justin's expression was unreadable. He set down his glass of wine and leaned back in his chair. "Look, babe, I already sent out the RSVPs. It's a little late to be changing things around. And anyway, I thought we agreed this party should be elegant. You know how she gets. Always stirring up something, right?" Noelle said nothing. Her hands clenched in her lap, hidden beneath the table. "I just want the night to be special for you," Justin added, his tone softening. "Glassy, no drama, no mess, just beautiful memories." She nodded slowly. "Of course." Later that night, lying in bed beside him, she stared at the ceiling while he slept. Her thoughts were loud in the dark. She remembered the way Laya used to laugh, loud, unfiltered, contagious. She remembered how they used to dream together, plan road trips, share music, paint in her dorm room until sunrise. She remembered how Laya had once told her, tears in her eyes, "He doesn't see you, Noe. He only sees who he wants you to be." Noelle had brushed it off at the time, told herself Laya was just being protective, just overreacting. But the memory of that conversation now made her chest ache. She rose quietly from the bed, tiptoed to the hallway, and slipped into her studio, a room Justin had converted into a guest room after claiming her paints smelled up the house. The easel still sat in the corner, draped in a linen sheet. She pulled it off, revealing a half-finished canvas. The colors were dull, hesitant. It had been her last attempt before she'd put her brushes away for good. She stood there for a long time, staring at it. Something inside her whispered, almost inaudibly, "Paint." But instead, she sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, and cried. Not loudly, not with shaking shoulders or sobs that split the air, just a steady stream of tears for the life she had built so carefully, so thoroughly, that she had disappeared into it. In the morning, Justin greeted her with a smile and a kiss, his eyes bright. Just a few more days until the big night. She nodded, her expression calm. But inside, something had shifted. She didn't know what yet, only that something had broken free. By the time Saturday arrived, Noelle felt like she was living inside a finely tuned performance, one she had rehearsed so many times that the lines came automatically, even as the meaning behind them drained away. Everything was set, orchestrated with the precision Justin prided himself on. The venue he had chosen, a sleek glass and brick estate nestled in the wooded hills just outside the city, gleamed like something out of a luxury magazine spread. She arrived with him in a chauffeured car just after dusk, dressed in a custom navy gown that hugged her curves and matched the exact shade of Justin's tie. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant bun, makeup flawless, accessories understated, just as he preferred. "Smile," he whispered as they stepped out onto the stone-paved entrance, photographers from his firm already in position for the arrival shot. Noelle smiled, her lips curved upward with practiced ease, her eyes shining only from the reflection of camera flashes. They posed, hand in hand, a picture of polished success, the accomplished power couple, radiant in their shared ambition and good fortune. To the watching world, they were everything. Inside, the reception hall had been transformed. A string quartet played softly near the arched windows, and servers glided through the room in crisp uniforms, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to an array of impeccably dressed guests. There were floral arrangements at every corner, silver and white orchids that matched the minimalist theme. Noelle's name was spelled in cursive lights across the back wall. "Happy birthday, Noelle." But even that felt more like branding than celebration. She moved through the crowd like a ghost in silk, accepting compliments, thanking people she barely knew, laughing on cue. Everyone there seemed to belong to Justin in some way. Partners from the firm, wealthy friends from his private school days, women she had only ever seen in curated Instagram posts, all calling her darling and stunning, and asking how she managed to keep it all together. "You're glowing, girl," one woman gushed, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Whatever your secret is, I need some." "Marry rich," Noelle wanted to say, but she only smiled and offered a demure, "Thank you." She felt invisible in her own skin. Somewhere near the open bar, Justin held court, surrounded by a small group of laughing men in tailored suits. He gestured with his glass, spoke with a confidence that made people lean in closer. Every now and then, he looked over at her and flashed a smile of approval, like a man proud of his prize. Noelle's throat tightened. She took a flute of champagne from a passing tray and sipped it too fast, welcoming the burn. The noise, the faces, the lights, everything seemed louder than it should be, and yet she felt numb, watching herself from a distance as if the night belonged to someone else. Then a voice behind her, warm, familiar, electric. "No." She turned sharply. Laya stood just inside the main entrance, dressed in a simple black jumpsuit, her hair in soft curls, eyes wide with uncertainty. For a moment, Noelle forgot how to breathe. They stared at each other, a beat too long, then Laya stepped forward and pulled her into a tight hug. "I can't believe you came," Noelle whispered. "You invited me," Laya replied. "How could I not?" Tears threatened to rise, but Noelle blinked them away. "I didn't think—" "You didn't have to think," Laya said softly, drawing back to look at her. "You just had to ask." They moved to a quieter corner just behind one of the tall indoor ferns. Noelle kept glancing around, half expecting Justin to appear, scolding her with a single look, but for the moment they were alone. "You look incredible," Laya said, "but exhausted." Noelle gave a dry laugh. "That obvious?" Laya took her hand. "You don't have to keep pretending, no, not with me." For a second, Noelle let herself rest in the truth of those words. She leaned in slightly, as if Laya's presence could anchor her to something real, something steady. Then the music shifted. The soft strings gave way to a new tempo, and the lights dimmed just slightly. A staff member approached with a smile, announcing that the slideshow was about to begin. Justin's voice echoed through the sound system, smooth and polished. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may steal your attention for a moment. Tonight is not just any evening. Tonight we celebrate the remarkable woman I'm lucky enough to call my wife. Noelle, this is for you." A screen lowered from the ceiling. The slideshow began. Images of Noelle and Justin over the years, curated perfectly. Vacations, galas, anniversaries, all framed by designer clothes and exotic backdrops. Laughter captured in stills, posed joy, manufactured intimacy. Then came the photo. Noelle felt it before she saw it. It was her at 17, hair in a puff, oversized sweater smeared with paint, seated cross-legged on her dorm bed, holding up a sketch pad toward the camera. On it, a portrait of a woman with fire for hair and stars in her eyes. Justin's voice accompanied the image. "And this," he said with a chuckle, "is when Noelle thought she'd be a painter. Can you believe it? Thank God she came to her senses, right?" Laughter rippled through the room. Noelle stood frozen. The picture on the screen glowed above her, casting light and shadow across her face. She felt naked, exposed in a way that made her blood burn. He had gone through her old albums, dug through the past she'd shared with vulnerability, and turned it into a joke. She glanced around. Some guests were still chuckling. Others shifted uncomfortably. Lia's face had gone stiff. "Don't," Lia whispered, grabbing her arm. "He's not worth it." But it was too late. Noelle's hand curled around the stem of her untouched coffee cup, the one she had specifically requested instead of champagne during dinner. Still warm. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the room. The music faded into silence. All eyes turned to her. Justin noticed her approach and smiled, expecting perhaps a kiss or a grateful speech. Noelle stopped 3 feet in front of him. The room held its breath. Then, without a word, she lifted the cup and flung its contents into his face. Gasps filled the air. The coffee splashed across his cheeks and collar, seeping into the fabric of his crisp white shirt. He recoiled, cursing, stumbling back. Someone dropped a glass behind them. Another person let out a shocked laugh. Noelle stood still, the empty cup trembling in her hand. She looked into his stunned eyes and spoke, her voice low and calm. "That's for every time you made me smaller so you could feel big." Then she turned, set the cup on a nearby table, and walked away. Lia was already moving, catching up to her near the exit. Noelle's heart pounded as she stepped into the cool night air, the quiet outside sharp and sobering. Her hands shook, but her spine felt straighter than it had in years. Lia opened the car door for her. Noelle hesitated only once, glancing back toward the lit windows where figures still hovered in shocked disbelief, then slid into the seat. Neither of them spoke as the car pulled away. Noelle leaned her head back and closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Not from regret, from release. The car ride away from the estate passed in silence, but the quiet was not empty. It was dense, humming with the weight of everything unspoken. Noelle sat still, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the road ahead, though she wasn't the one driving. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, deliberate and deep, the way someone breathes after breaking the surface of deep water. The car interior smelled faintly of leather and lilacs, Lia's perfume still soft in the air. Outside, the trees blurred past like ghostly sentinels in the dark, their shadows stretching across the windshield like questions she was not yet ready to answer. Lia didn't press her. She kept her eyes on the road, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting loosely on the gear shift, her posture relaxed, but her presence vigilant. There was comfort in that, the quiet kind that wrapped around Noelle like a weighted blanket. The farther they drove from the glittering estate, from the laughter and gasps and stunned silence, the more the evening began to dissolve behind them, like fog retreating under morning light. Noelle's hand still tingled from the heat of the coffee she had thrown. It hadn't been scalding, just hot enough to jolt, to sting, to make a point. But it wasn't about the temperature. It was about the moment. The reclamation. The split second where she had stopped being a silent fixture in Justin's curated world and had become someone who acted, someone who chose. The vision of his face, stunned, wet, slack with disbelief, wouldn't leave her mind. Neither would the quiet gasp that followed, the hush that swallowed the room, and the click of her own heels as she turned her back on it all. She hadn't said goodbye, hadn't paused to explain herself. There had been no speech, no theatrics, no pleading for understanding. She had simply left. And now, here she was, in Lia's car, driving through the quiet suburbs toward some undefined destination. Home wasn't an option, not anymore. That place, his place, had ceased to be her sanctuary long ago. Tonight only made it undeniable. Lia glanced at her as they slowed at a red light. "You okay?" Noelle nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know." Lia waited, then asked gently, "Where do you want to go?" It was a question so simple and so vast that Noelle felt her throat tighten. Where did she want to go? She didn't even know where she could go. She had money, her own account carefully maintained even through Justin's subtle attempts to merge everything. She had her ID, her phone, her keys, but she had no plan, no packed bag, no destination in mind, only an ache in her chest and the echo of her own voice saying, "That's for every time you made me smaller." She exhaled slowly. "Can I stay at your place? Just for tonight." Lia reached over and squeezed her hand. "For as long as you need." They drove the rest of the way without speaking. When they arrived, Lia's apartment building stood like a quiet beacon, modest and warm, its windows glowing with soft yellow light. The lobby smelled like clean tile and eucalyptus. The familiarity of it brought a sudden rush of tears to Noelle's eyes. Lia's apartment was small but homey. Books lined the walls, plants hung in clay pots near the windows, and the air smelled like vanilla and something savory simmering from earlier. Noelle kicked off her shoes at the door and stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, arms hanging limp at her sides. She hadn't realized until that moment how tense her body had been all evening, how tightly wound her muscles, how shallow her breathing. Lia disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. "You should drink." Noelle took it and sat down on the couch, cradling the glass like something fragile. Her hands shook slightly. Lia sat beside her, not too close, not too far. After a long moment, Noelle spoke. "I didn't know I was going to do it," she said softly. "I know," Lia replied. It happened. One second I was standing there, and the next—" She stopped, eyes closing. "God, Lia, I threw coffee in his face." "You threw it in his ego," Lia said. "His face just happened to be in the way." Noelle let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "He's going to lose it. I mean, really lose it. Let him." Lia's voice was firm, grounded. "Let him lose whatever version of control he thought he had. That's not your responsibility." Noelle stared at her. "Do you know how long I've been afraid to do something like that? Not just the coffee. I mean, anything. Speak up, push back, even say no without adding 3 apologies after." "Yeah," Lia said. "I know." The truth in her voice undid something inside Noelle. She leaned forward, rested her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her hands. The sobs came quietly, one after another, not theatrical or loud, but deep and weary. They spilled from her, not just from the night, but from the years that led to it. Years of silence, of smiling when she wanted to scream, of accommodating someone else's comfort at the expense of her own. Lia didn't say anything. She rubbed Noelle's back gently, her presence steady and sure, like a lighthouse in the stormy water. When the tears finally stopped, Noelle sat up, eyes puffy, voice hoarse. "What am I going to do?" "We'll figure it out," Lia said. "You don't have to have all the answers tonight. Tonight, you just rest." Noelle nodded, too tired to argue. Lia showed her to the guest room. It was small and tidy, with soft sheets and a stack of folded blankets on the dresser. There was a diffuser on the nightstand, already misting lavender into the air. Noelle sat on the edge of the bed and watched the steam curl upward like breath. She changed into the oversized t-shirt Leah handed her and lay down. The mattress dipped beneath her weight, the sheets cool against her skin. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, replaying the evening again and again. The laughter, the photo, the weight of the cup in her hand. Eventually, she closed her eyes. The last thought she had before sleep took her was not of Justin's face or the guest gasps, but of her own reflection in the mirror of the powder room at the estate. She had caught a glimpse of herself there, flushed, trembling, alive. In the morning, she woke early. The apartment was quiet, the sun not yet above the horizon. She wrapped herself in a blanket and padded into the living room where Lia had left her phone charging on the coffee table. Notifications buzzed the screen to life, missed calls, unread messages. Justin. Several from unknown numbers. A few from mutual acquaintances. "Are you okay? What happened?" OMG, that was wild. She didn't open any of them. Instead, she opened her banking app. The balance was healthy. She checked her calendar. Meetings she wouldn't attend. A hair appointment Justin had booked for her. She deleted it. Then she opened a browser and typed, "Abuse lawyer, women's support," and scrolled until she found something that looked like more than just lip service. A local office run by women, specializing in family law and protective separation. She stared at the number, memorized it, closed the screen. Lia emerged from her bedroom not long after, yawning, hair wrapped in a scarf. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep anymore." "Want coffee?" Noelle paused. "Only if there's cream and cinnamon." Lia grinned. "Now you're talking." Over breakfast, toast, eggs, real coffee, Noelle told her everything. Not just about the party, but about all of it. The slow erosion, the constant second-guessing, the way she had learned to be quiet, to shrink, to twist herself into something that wouldn't provoke disapproval. She spoke in halting sentences at first, but soon the words flowed. Lia listened, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When she finished, they sat in silence for a while. Then Lia reached for a pen and a piece of paper and began writing a list. "Okay," she said, "here's what we're going to do." Noelle watched her. "You don't have to. I want to. And more importantly, you need to." She looked at the list. Lawyer, documents, clothes, mail forwarding, new phone. It was the beginning of something, the beginning of a plan. Later that afternoon, Noelle returned to Justin's house one last time, with Lia beside her, to collect her essentials. He wasn't there. The house was quiet, colder than she remembered. Her keys still worked. She moved quickly, gathering what she could. Clothes, her laptop, a few mementos she wasn't ready to leave behind. Laya found the emergency cash box in the closet, still untouched. Noelle tucked it into her bag. On the way out, she paused at the front door. The photos on the hallway wall stared back at her. Engagement, wedding, vacations, smiling lies. She reached for one frame, removed the photo, and left the empty frame hanging. The sound of the door clicking shut behind her was the softest noise in the world, but to her it sounded like thunder. Noelle hadn't realized how much of her life had been muted until the silence began to feel real. Not the careful, curated stillness of her former home, where every footstep echoed against surfaces too clean to touch. This silence was different. It came with soft morning light streaming through Laya's linen curtains and the distant hum of life outside. Neighbors starting their cars, children calling to one another as they walked to school, birdsong carried on a breeze. She stood barefoot in Laya's small kitchen, warming her hands around a chipped mug filled with coffee that smelled the way she remembered it from years ago. Strong, a touch of sweetness, a hint of cinnamon. The warmth of it felt like a whisper to the parts of her that had gone cold. It had only been 2 days since she'd left, but already time felt strange, stretched thin in some places and knotted in others. She kept checking her phone out of habit, even though she had silenced notifications. Dozens of texts had piled up from Justin, and each time she saw his name on the lock screen, a small jolt of dread spiked in her chest. Some of the messages had started kindly. "Come home, Noelle. Let's talk." "I didn't mean it." Then the tone shifted. "You embarrassed me. You humiliated yourself. You're making a mistake." Finally, they grew darker. "If you're not back by the end of the week, I'm calling your boss. I'll make sure everyone sees who you really are." She hadn't replied to any of them, not because she didn't have words, she had too many, but because she knew it wouldn't matter. Justin didn't want a conversation. He wanted her surrender. He wanted control reestablished. And that door, once so familiar, now stood firmly closed behind her. Laya entered the kitchen with her usual energy, wearing leggings and a hoodie, her curls tied up high. "You're up early again," she said, opening the fridge. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," Noelle said, her voice still scratchy from the night. "I keep waking up thinking I'm back there." Laya nodded, not pushing. "Nightmares?" "Not exactly. Just remembering things I didn't even realize I'd forgotten. The way he used to move things I'd left out, like my keys or my sketchbook, and say I was getting forgetful. The way I started saying sorry for everything, even when I wasn't sure what I did. I don't know how I lived like that for so long." "Because you were surviving," Laya said gently. "Now you're waking up." Later that morning, they sat together on the couch, notebooks and laptops spread across the coffee table. Noelle had finally called the law office she had bookmarked days earlier. A woman named Vanessa picked up, a calm, clear voice, professional but kind. By the time Noelle hung up, she had an appointment scheduled for the next afternoon. She didn't realize how tightly she'd been holding her breath until she set the phone down and her shoulders slumped forward in release. They spent the rest of the morning making lists. It was Laya's idea, and it helped. Small goals, tangible steps, clothes to replace what she left behind, documents to organize, utilities to transfer, a checklist for a new phone and email address. Each item crossed off was a small claim to her independence, a brick in the foundation of a life she could build on her own terms. In the afternoon, they ventured to a department store downtown. Noelle chose items slowly, carefully. Jeans that felt soft against her skin, a sweater in a bold mustard yellow, undergarments that didn't feel like armor. She surprised herself by picking out a pair of earrings she never would have worn in her old life. Silver hoops, slightly oversized, unapologetically loud. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, a shadow of a smile crept across her face. It didn't last, but it was enough to remind her she was still in there, underneath the layers she had learned to wear for someone else. That night, curled on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs and Laya flipping through channels beside her, Noelle allowed herself to imagine what came next. Not just the logistics, the divorce, the apartment, the job, but the deeper question: what would it mean to live as herself again? What did she even like? What music? What food? What kind of art did she want to make, if any? She couldn't remember the last time she'd created something without hearing Justin's voice in her head, telling her it was childish or impractical or a waste of time. But now that voice had started to lose its volume. It no longer boomed. It muttered, distant and dim. By the end of the week, Noelle had a new phone with a clean number. She let a few close colleagues know she'd be unreachable for a while and declined all meetings. Her boss, a shrewd but surprisingly empathetic woman named Nina, offered to let her take a leave of absence. Noelle accepted. There was no shame in pausing, only survival. One morning, while Laya was at work, Noelle took her laptop to a coffee shop down the block. It was a cozy place, all brick and mismatched furniture, with a chalkboard menu and the smell of fresh pastries in the air. She ordered a chai latte with almond milk and cinnamon, then took a seat by the window. For the first few minutes, she just watched people walk by: students, delivery drivers, couples holding hands. The normalcy of it made her ache. She opened a blank document and typed her name. Then she stared at the cursor blinking beside it. She didn't know what she meant to write: an email, a journal, a manifesto, but her fingers moved anyway. She wrote about the coffee cup, about the heaviness of the silence that came before it, about how everyone watched her like she was the one who broke something sacred. She wrote about the photo of herself as a teenager, about how it felt to see her younger self become the punchline of a man's joke. She wrote about walking out, about the rush of it, about the fear that came later. The words came fast, raw, unedited. When she finally stopped, her hands were trembling again, but in a different way. Not from fear, from release. The next day at her lawyer's office, she sat across from Vanessa, who explained the process calmly, outlining every legal step she would take to protect Noelle's assets and ensure her safety. They would file for divorce, citing emotional abuse, establish a restraining order, freeze joint accounts, secure her credit. Vanessa asked if there had ever been physical violence. Noelle hesitated. Not really. He never hit me. But there were moments. He threw a plate once, slammed doors, punched a wall. Vanessa nodded. That counts. They discussed the house, the assets, the potential backlash. At the end of the meeting, Vanessa looked her in the eye and said, "You're doing something brave. It might not feel like it now, but it is." That night, Laya surprised her with takeout from their favorite college restaurant, a Caribbean place tucked away on a quiet corner they used to visit after late-night study sessions. They ate on the floor, laughing at old memories, telling stories with their mouths full. For the first time in a long while, Noelle laughed without thinking about who might hear. Later, after Laya had gone to bed, Noelle stood alone in the guest room, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the pile of papers she had brought home from Vanessa's office. Divorce papers, affidavits, financial statements, her past printed in black and white. She flipped through them slowly, letting the weight of it sink in. Every page was a step away from Justin. A step back to herself. She found her sketchbook buried in her tote bag. It had only a few blank pages left. She opened to one of them and picked up a pen. She drew a woman with her eyes closed and her arms open wide, wind in her hair, the outline of mountains behind her. There were no colors, no details, just form and motion and breath. She stared at it for a long time. Then she turned the page and kept going. Noelle had not expected the silence of living alone to feel so full. It was a different silence than she had ever known. It didn't press down on her or echo off the walls in ways that made her feel small. It was a companionable quiet, filled with the gentle creaks of an old floor, the hum of a refrigerator, the faint whir of traffic several stories below. The studio apartment she had found was modest, with paint slightly chipped near the baseboards and windows that fogged easily in the mornings, but it was hers. The lease had her name on it, only her name, and the key felt like a victory every time it turned in the lock. The move happened quickly, faster than she thought possible, but once the paperwork was signed and the deposit cleared, everything else followed like breath after suffocation. Leah and Tom helped her carry the boxes up the narrow stairwell on a rainy Saturday morning. Most of what she owned now fit into 3 suitcases and 4 cardboard boxes, and yet it felt like more than enough. Each item was chosen with intention. A lamp with a gold base and a woven shade she'd found in a thrift store. A second-hand desk with uneven legs that she balanced with an old magazine. A shower curtain with bright teal and coral patterns that clashed delightfully with the plain tile. They unpacked everything in a few hours, setting dishes into the small cabinets and folding sweaters into the single-bedroom closet. By evening, the apartment looked lived in, warm, promising. They sat on the floor, surrounded by takeout containers, eating pizza with their hands, the air filled with the smell of garlic and rain and new beginnings. When they left, and the door clicked shut behind them, Noelle stood for a moment in the center of the room, barefoot, hands on her hips. The walls, still bare, felt like pages waiting to be written on. She exhaled slowly, then she smiled. The following days settled into a rhythm. Mornings were hers. She began each one by brewing coffee with cinnamon and cream, pouring it into the same chipped mug from Leah's kitchen. She would curl into the armchair by the window with her sketchbook balanced on her knees and draw. Sometimes faces, sometimes hands, sometimes just abstract shapes that spilled out of her without explanation. There was no goal, no deadline, only the act of creation, and in it, a kind of healing. In the afternoons, she visited the bookstore. Megan, Leah's cousin, welcomed her like family. The cozy corner was tucked between a yoga studio and a florist shop, and it smelled like old paper, pine, and candle wax. The floors creaked, the windows fogged. The register was temperamental, and Noelle adored it. She started working part-time, shelving books, chatting with customers, curating small displays of poetry and memoirs. Megan gave her freedom to create, encouraged her to arrange the window display however she liked, and even offered her a wall in the cafe section to showcase her artwork once she was ready. The first time someone asked her for a book recommendation and she answered without hesitation, she felt a flicker of the confidence she hadn't realized she'd lost. One afternoon, after closing, Megan handed her an envelope. Inside was her first paycheck. It wasn't much, certainly not what she'd earned at the firm, but it was money she had made on her own, doing something that didn't drain the life out of her. As she walked home through the crisp fall air, she stopped to buy groceries. Just a few things: a bundle of spinach, a block of cheese, bread from the bakery, oranges. No one commented on her choices. No one teased her for buying too many carbs. She picked up a small bottle of red wine, something she hadn't done in years without first hearing Justin's opinion on tannins or vintage. She carried it all back to her apartment in a canvas tote bag with paint smudges on the straps and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a woman returning to her life rather than escaping it. That night, she sat at her new desk and opened her laptop. The screen glowed against the darkness of the room. She opened a new document and titled it "The Girl Who Disappeared." It wasn't the final title. It might never be a finished book. But the words that followed spilled out with surprising ease. She wrote about isolation disguised as love, about the ways manipulation doesn't always shout. It whispers and flatters and smiles while it erodes your certainty. She wrote about the mornings she woke up unsure of what she had done wrong, and the nights she went to bed apologizing for being too tired, too quiet, too much. She wrote about the mask of a perfect couple, about the curated photos, about the subtle silencing that became habitual until silence felt like safety. When she stopped, the clock read just past midnight. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then she clicked save and closed the laptop. Over the next week, she continued to meet with Vanessa. The divorce was progressing. Justin had responded to the papers with what Vanessa called performative outrage. Empty threats, requests for mediation, a barrage of emails that grew less coherent by the day. But Vanessa was steady, relentless, precise. She had dealt with men like Justin before. Noel had provided documentation, screenshots of his messages, financial records, statements from friends. She had written a formal affidavit that made her hands tremble and her stomach twist, but when she handed it in, she felt lighter. There was a moment, standing in Vanessa's office, when she realized she hadn't spoken to Justin in nearly 3 weeks. She hadn't heard his voice, hadn't been forced to measure her tone, hadn't smiled through clenched teeth. That silence, the one that once would have filled her with panic, now felt like space, like air. She spent her evenings at home drawing. She filled page after page of her sketchbook, then moved on to larger pieces. She bought canvas from a supply store and painted a woman curled into herself, then another standing tall in a field of wind. She painted hands reaching, mouths open in song, a tangle of red lines over a black background. When Megan saw one of the pieces, she asked if Noel would be willing to hang it in the cafe space. Noel hesitated. The idea of others seeing her work, of being seen, was still foreign, but she agreed. The painting was up for less than a day before someone asked if it was for sale. On a Friday afternoon, Megan handed her a note that had been left by a customer. It read, "Your art made me feel something I thought I lost. Thank you for making it." Noelle read the message twice, then folded it into her wallet like a charm. She started cooking again. She played music she liked. She lit candles that reminded her of college, of home. She danced alone in the living room. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she laughed so suddenly it startled her. One evening, she received a message from Justin's assistant. It was short. "He's asked me to send you the rest of your things. Where should I deliver them?" She typed her new address, paused, then deleted it. Instead, she wrote, "Please donate anything I didn't take. I won't be needing it." Then she turned off her phone and returned to her painting. That weekend, she visited her parents. She had spoken to them briefly after the party debacle, offering only a vague explanation. This time, she sat across from them at their kitchen table and told the whole story. Her mother cried. Her father clenched his jaw. Neither said, "We told you so." They said, "We're proud of you." Her mother pressed a folded quilt into her hands as she left, blue and gold and stitched with care. "I made this for you when you first moved in with him," she said. "I always hoped it would keep you safe. Maybe now it finally can." Back at her apartment, Noelle laid the quilt across the end of her bed and ran her fingers over the seams. The walls around her were bare, but they held warmth, not from paint or decor, but from presence. Her own. She lay down and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would go back to the bookstore. She would paint. She would write. The past was not undone, but it was no longer her compass. She was building something new now, and for the first time in years, the name on her mailbox, Noelle Elise Morgan, felt like a declaration. Not Mrs. Campbell, not Justin's wife, just Noelle. And that was enough. The morning was quiet, wrapped in the soft hush of early light and the warmth of the quilt her mother had given her. Noelle lay still beneath it, blinking up at the ceiling, the familiar cracks in the old plaster now as known to her as constellations in the night sky. Her body was heavy with sleep, but her mind alert, humming with the low rhythm of thoughts that had begun forming even before she opened her eyes. This was the first morning in a long time that she didn't feel the pressure of proving herself to anyone. The weight that had once nested permanently in her chest, tight and suffocating, was gone, replaced by something fragile and unfamiliar. Space. She'd been afraid of it before. Now it felt like freedom. She slipped out of bed, padded into the kitchen, and started the kettle. Her apartment, though small, felt lived in now. It bore her imprint. Sketches taped to the fridge, a growing stack of used books by the window, jars of paintbrushes lining the windowsill. The hardwood creaked beneath her feet. The cabinet stuck just slightly when pulled, and the radiator rattled at night like an old man clearing his throat. But it was hers. It belonged to no one else. And for the first time, neither did she. She brewed her coffee, real cream, 2 dashes of cinnamon, and sat in her usual chair by the window. Outside, the street was beginning to stir. A boy in a red hoodie kicked a soccer ball beside his sister, who skipped along the sidewalk, clutching a juice box. A couple walked their dog, chatting as steam curled from their cups. Ordinary scenes, yet they moved her more deeply now. There was something about simplicity that she had come to crave. She reached for her sketchbook, flipped to a clean page, and began to draw. Today it was hands, intertwined, strong, gentle. She traced the lines slowly, letting her thoughts drift. There was so much she wanted to do now, so much she hadn't dared to imagine before. When she arrived at the bookstore later that morning, Megan was already there, balancing a stack of returns while speaking softly to a customer at the register. She smiled when she saw Noelle. There was no pity in her eyes, no curiosity laced with gossip, just quiet respect, the kind that acknowledged without needing to ask. "Can you help me with the window display?" Megan asked as she passed. Noelle nodded, pulling her coat off and rolling up her sleeves. Together, they unpacked boxes of new arrivals, arranging them into themes: poetry of resistance, memoirs by women reclaiming their stories, novels that centered Black protagonists in all their complexity. Noelle handled each book like a fragile truth. She loved the feeling of stories in her hands, the smell of ink and paper, the weight of words made permanent. After lunch, she made her way to the back corner of the store where her painting now hung, an abstract swirl of crimson and navy with hints of gold and bone white bleeding through the brushstrokes. A small placard read, "Resurgence by Noelle E. Morgan." People had started noticing. A woman stopped her the day before to ask what inspired the piece. Noelle had smiled and simply said, "Starting over?" That afternoon, as she restocked a shelf in the nonfiction section, Megan approached with a hesitant smile. "Someone left this for you." She handed her a folded sheet of paper, creased with care. Noelle opened it and read, "Your art is a mirror. It made me see myself again. Thank you for creating something that speaks without needing permission." Noelle's hands trembled as she folded the note. It was the third message she'd received since putting her work on display. Each one felt like a gentle echo returning from the world, a confirmation that her voice, long silenced, had found resonance. The following evening, she received an email that made her heart leap. It was from a small, independent art collective downtown that Megan had encouraged her to submit work to. They were curating a spring exhibit titled Unbound, focused on personal transformation and reclamation. They had reviewed her samples and wanted to include her in the lineup. She read the email twice, then a third time, hardly believing the words. She had submitted her portfolio on a whim, not expecting a response. Yet here it was. She was invited, wanted, seen. She called Laya immediately. Her friend screamed in delight. "I told you," Laya said. "All you had to do was open the door. The rest of you was ready." "I don't know if I'm ready for people to see everything." "You already let them see you," Laya replied. "Now it's time you saw yourself." After she hung up, Noelle stood in front of the largest canvas in her living room. It was still blank, untouched. She had been saving it for something she didn't yet understand. Now she picked up a brush and made the first stroke. A bold arc of deep blue, curving upward like a breath held and then released. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. She painted late into the night, letting music fill the air around her as color bled across canvas after canvas. She painted joy and fury, sorrow and survival. She painted her silence, her scream, her return. One piece in particular held her for hours, a woman's back, bare and unguarded, facing a storm of color. It was the opposite of a retreat. It was a stand. She named it Still Here. By the time the night of the exhibit arrived, she had 10 pieces framed and titled. The gallery was modest, the crowd intimate, but the atmosphere pulsed with emotion. As she entered, wearing a long maroon coat and boots that clicked softly against the floor, she felt her stomach twist. Not with fear, with anticipation. People moved slowly from painting to painting, sipping wine, murmuring. Noelle stood near the back, watching them engage with her work. She didn't need to explain. She had already spoken, each brushstroke a sentence, each shadow a memory, each contrast a refusal to be simplified. One woman stood for a long time in front of Still Here. When she turned, her eyes were glassy. "Is this you?" she asked. "Yes," Noelle answered, "and it's every woman I've ever known." They spoke briefly, but the words barely mattered. What passed between them was deeper than language. It was recognition. Later that night, as the gallery emptied and the lights dimmed, Noelle walked alone to a nearby diner, her hands tucked in her pockets, the night crisp and clean. She sat at the counter, ordered a grilled cheese and tomato soup, and pulled out her notebook. She began writing. Not an email, not a journal entry, a book. Maybe fiction, maybe not. She didn't yet know where the story would go, only that it began with a woman waking up in a home that no longer felt like her own, staring at a mirror and realizing she didn't recognize the reflection. She wrote until her food arrived. Then she set the notebook aside and took the first bite of her sandwich. It tasted better than anything she'd had in months. At home, she curled into bed with the window cracked open. Outside, the city hummed its lullaby. Inside, the walls breathed around her. On her nightstand, beside her sketchbook and a small vase of dried lavender, sat her latest mail. A single envelope addressed to Noelle E. Morgan. She touched her name with the tips of her fingers, tracing each letter. She was no longer anyone's wife, no longer someone else's silence. She was the author now, of her name, her space, her life, and tomorrow she would begin again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to continue exploring powerful stories and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.